PvP. It's quite a precarious thing that we love in games, yet such an integral and necessary part in others. In the case of Lost Skies, hands down one of the most asked about questions regarding the game's development. So I think it's time to get into the real answer to this question, focus on the actual feasibility of this, and some of the ongoing problems in relation to Lost Skies and Worlds Adrift as a whole. Now, I for one have always loved PvP-focused games. For the longest time, I've been an avid player of games like Apex, Titanfall, and largely Rust, but on a deeper level, these types of games often take the category of PvP to be its pivotal focus of interest. And while there certainly is nothing wrong with that, it doesn't always mean it should be the main focus of a game. Nor does it mean that every game needs a PvP directive to be engaging and successful. This is true even in certain aspects of Worlds Adrift, where it did have a developed PvP function, but despite this had much of its gameplay built upon the exploration of the world itself, where you could travel with your ships to vastly uncharted areas among the clouds, challenging the great walls that segregated the world, working with friends or new people that you came across in your journey, and in a game where the islands in it are always changing as the community itself builds upon the very world you explore. This often offered the potential for a new experience at any given point. And even in my own experience, I think it's why I naturally gravitated toward a game like Rust. That feeling of joining a brand new wiped server with new map structure, new people, and new encounters, and that constant edge of not knowing whether someone could show up and take it all from you in a second was exciting. And similar to life, it was a game that offered that feeling of wanting to conquer. Because in a game like that, no one was truly unstoppable. No group, no matter how big, was always 100% unbeatable. And at the end of the day, it came down not to just how skilled you were at fighting, but how you played your situation and could outsmart your opponent. And likewise to Worlds Adrift, I think in many ways people found enjoyment in that very same feeling. However, as we've seen regarding the ends of Worlds Adrift, with the difficulties of sustaining costly servers in perpetuity, despite a large-scale server structure being highly sought after in certain games, this doesn't mean it will always work out in the long run. Nor does it mean that it can last as a sustainable business model. And I'm more than sure the devs have taken a hard look at the past, and instead of repeating the mistakes of before, they've been working tirelessly to create a style of game that works. The structure of Lost Skies will have a massive open world of unique handcrafted floating islands where you can play solo or with up to 6 players on a player-hosted server, where the world itself will be ever expanding as the very community continuously adds more islands to the game. You'll be able to build unique skyships and turn them into your real home, where you can explore the vast wildlife, complex weather systems and weather walls, and even face the terrifying, monstrous beings and explosive naval-style boss fights, testing the limits of your acquired skills and technology. But to answer the constant overarching question of whether or not Lost Skies will have PvP, the short answer is yes, kind of. But the more accurate answer is that Lost Skies will have a toggleable feature in the self-hosted server options. Turn PvP off and on as desired by the host. And the devs have made it clear that while this will be a function, the game itself will not be designed around PvP as its focus, nor will it be directed and balanced around this idea. Now, I've seen many ask at this point who really want the game to have a PvP directive ask why the devs can't just add the functions for larger servers similar to games like Rust or Minecraft. Why can't you just make the game have the option for large-scale MMO functions later on? And while this seems simple enough out loud, the reality is much more difficult to answer than you would think. And the real complexity of this question comes down to the finer details of how the game itself is designed, largely from the get-go. And making such a big change to what they create later on can effectively change the game drastically. And on another note, the undertaking to make such a big change to the structure of any game can sometimes be so large in certain cases that you might effectively be recreating the entire game from scratch. See, there's a number of complex ways to go about creating a multiplayer game, so much so that I went to a good friend of mine in the Lost Skies Discord community named Rin to help explain some of the possible methods of actually implementing a multiplayer system in a game, but in the sense of what type of system seems to be the ones the devs likely are using for Lost Skies. Most of the evidence would lead you to believe they're using what's called an authoritative replication peer-to-peer structure. While this is a mouthful of a jank wording, to break down these different pieces, referring to the authoritative part, this effectively is saying that the computer hosting a game has the final say on a game's state, which means that if a player disconnects from that game, the last set of information the server received is what's considered the truth. In a non-authoritative game structure, each individual person within a game will have their own given reality or state of what the simulated game believes to be true. This, however, is not generally used as it's more difficult on the development process and takes more bandwidth. So generally it's used in different styles of games where there's clear turn-based system of states that can be easily confirmed as true, maybe in online card games, for example. As to the replication of the peer-to-peer structure part, this refers to a system where servers receive inputs by the player, let's say movement for example. The server, once receiving the inputs of the player moving, replicates the state itself, which means generally things like physics are handled by the server, and the physics of objects within the server are sent back to the clients or players to understand what state they're in. Bryn also provided an awesome example here to help demonstrate this system using a server and 2 players in it, where he starts at the bottom left using client 2. In this example, you can think of this box as player who is about to move in a multiplayer game, where you can see the pink box / player starts to move. A red box then quickly follows behind, which represents the server's interpretation of that movement, where on the right you can see 2 red boxes. One is the server's interpretation of client 2 moving, and the other is stationary, representing what player 1 is doing, which is standing completely still. And this method is actually quite common in most games as well. You can probably think of many AAA games where the server is lagging or slowing down, and in these scenarios you might notice things like players rubber banding. These types of games in general usually are made with that same type of peer-to-peer replication method we talked about. And while these different processes sound simple enough, the complexity begins to expand vastly at different degrees of what the server has to compute. And in many cases, you need implemented verification steps for the functions of larger servers, and even a structure that is able to deduce if a player is hacking or cheating at each stage of server interpretation. And likely in the case of Lost Skies, have a reliable method that's able to effectively handle the many different physics of building ships and other objects all at the same time. Essentially, what becomes a bigger problem is when someone running a self-hosted server wants more and more people to join. And especially in the case of handling more people, the physics loading for whatever device is hosting will only become bigger and bigger. Effectively, when it comes down to the case of Lost Skies, we know that the co-op group size in a given self-hosted server is planned to be 6, with the possible server options to allow for more. However, the potential to scale this server size isn't always a linear issue. Sometimes when game developers optimize the design of their game, it may be more beneficial to the game itself to create different in-game effects or methods of in-game rendering that's more beneficial in the use of a 6-player size server design, or whatever player size that they may want for that given game. And scaling the amount of physics required can be less of a straight incline and more of a sharp uphill battle. In the scenario of hosting large servers, oftentimes there are 2 types of scaling that allow for large servers to run big physics loads. In general, these are called horizontal and vertical scaling. Vertical generally means upgrading the hardware or devices that are used to run the servers. Although this method generally doesn't scale as well and usually has the upper limits of the cost to reward output. Horizontal scaling, on the flip side, is where you have multiple computers to handle work separately from one another. This method is often most preferred for fast-paced matchmaking games where any lag is very noticeable, and for MMOs where you can divide areas of each server into different nodes. In addition, horizontal scaling comes with the benefit of having region-based servers, as you likely have seen in many AAA games, which exist for the purpose of reducing in-game latency by having those servers physically closer to the player. One prime example that we can think of that attempted to handle this was Worlds Adrift itself. See, Worlds Adrift, unlike Lost Skies, use massive large-scale servers through the use of something called Spatial OS. This cloud-based platform allowed the devs to create an immersive world by combining large nodes or servers and essentially stitching them together as one. The problem with using this was that the entire game's infrastructure was effectively built upon this service. And since Spatial OS isn't legally BOSA Games' own tech or code, They were effectively locked into using this service the minute they started to build the game. I remember many people who were sad and unhappy about the situation of what made Worlds Adrift fall, and how many people who just wanted to be able to play the game were wondering why the devs couldn't have just switched it over from an MMO to a self-hosted game. However, since the company was effectively paying a third-party vendor to make the game even function at ridiculously high prices, they would have had to de-integrate every individual tiny piece of the game from their system. This undertaking would have essentially made no sense to do from a time perspective. It would basically be remaking the entire game from the ground up. The more logical thing to do in this scenario would be to drop the game entirely. Refocus your efforts into other games and titles until you're in a position to build enough capital that you can revisit the concept the devs love so dearly. And that is exactly what they did and are trying to do now with Lost Skies, by creating a game that utilizes the similar concepts and style of a game that many came to love, while not creating a dependency on the previous server hosting method. The devs can be put into a position to not bleed money indefinitely, such that they have more time to actually focus on making the game itself great, rather than dealing with the constant issues of large-scale servers. Now, to those that, despite this, really want to have a large-scale hosted server, in theory it might be possible, but again it comes down to how the devs made their new system. I don't think it's reasonable to try and push them to make this their directive either. I think it's better to trust in their vision for Lost Skies rather than force them to make Lost Skies in the image of Worlds Adrift. In simple terms, all I'm trying to say is let them cook. They know what they have in mind for their vision of this game, and I think it makes much more sense to trust what they have planned and let the results speak for themselves rather than try and force some of what made Worlds Adrift great onto Lost Skies. This reminded me of a comment someone made on a previous video that I posted on this channel called "Let's Not No Man's Sky the New Worlds Adrift," where the main focus of that video used the comparison of the devs who made No Man's Sky, how their marketing from the game completely outcompeted the reality of what they had actually finished in their game. Throughout that video, I made the example that Worlds Adrift was a benefit to Lost Skies, and that calling upon the audience of those who are reminiscent of the game's title was a fantastic way to bring life into Lost Skies, and that using the island creator of Worlds Adrift, which even today is still open to the public, would give people a realistic comparison to use for some of the potential structure of Lost Skies. However, the person that commented on my video made the point that we should also not Worlds Adrift Lost Skies, as Worlds Adrift will use an entirely different aesthetic and structure and is marketed as a competitive PvP game, while Lost Skies is clearly designed as a PvE game with a co-op focus. Of course, that only brushes the surface of the differences, but the point being made here is that while Worlds Adrift can provide a good insight to some similar aspects of Lost Skies, it's hard to tell if creating the association of Worlds Adrift to Lost Skies is something that will benefit the future of the game. Instinctually, those that had poor experiences with Worlds Adrift, if they come to hear offhand that the game is just a Worlds Adrift 2, when in fact it not only isn't, but doesn't even have the same style or design focus, some may be more likely to dismiss the game rather than consider it as something in its own right. I once thought before that the title of Worlds Adrift would help spark a larger audience to promote Lost Skies' future. I once thought it was something that could only benefit the game and developers themselves. However, at this exact same time, I think that the two games, if they aren't separated in their own right, Lost Skies might not be seen so much as its own title, and rather just a rehash of a game that doesn't even have the same focus or idea. In the end, I want people to see Lost Skies for what it is, rather than just what Worlds Adrift once was. That's all I have to talk about, so I thank you and have a beautiful rest of your day, boys. Peace.